December 6, 1944. 3 American destroyers slice through midnight waters toward certain death. Ormoc Bay, a fortress bristling with guns, submarines, and aircraft, waits in absolute darkness. The mission: destroy Japan's final lifeline to Leyte or die trying. In 60 seconds, USS Cooper will vanish beneath the Pacific. Her crew will have no time to scream. This is the story of the men who sailed into hell knowing they might never return, and the night that changed the course of the Philippine campaign forever. What happened in those blood-soaked waters would be whispered about for generations. But first, you need to understand why they went at all. The phosphorescence trailing behind the 3 destroyers glowed like liquid starlight in the tropical darkness, each churning propeller leaving a spectral wake across the Camotes Sea as the ships drove south through the velvet night of December 6, 1944. Aboard USS M. Sumner, Moale, and Cooper, young men barely out of their teenage years, stood at battle stations, their hands slick with sweat despite the salt spray that periodically crashed over the bows. The air itself seemed to vibrate with suppressed violence, thick and humid, carrying the distant rumble of artillery from Leyte's mountainous interior, where American soldiers and Japanese defenders were locked in a brutal contest for every ridge, every ravine, every blood-soaked meter of jungle. These 3 Sumner-class destroyers, fresh from American shipyards with their dual-purpose 5-inch guns and sleek, predatory lines, represented the cutting edge of naval engineering. But on this night they were sailing into waters that had already claimed too many American ships, into a bay that Japanese commanders had transformed into a maritime killing field. The mission was simple in conception, suicidal in execution. Ormoc Bay on Leyte's western coast had become Japan's critical artery, the last functioning resupply route through which reinforcements, ammunition, food, and medicine flowed to General Tomoyuki Yamashita's beleaguered forces fighting desperately to hold the island against Douglas MacArthur's relentless advance. Ever since the apocalyptic naval engagements of Leyte Gulf in late October, when the Imperial Japanese Navy had thrown everything it possessed into a catastrophic gamble to destroy the American landing forces and lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers in the process, the strategic situation had shifted irrevocably. But Yamashita, brilliant and stubborn, refused to concede Leyte. He understood what Tokyo's high command seemed unable or unwilling to accept: that Leyte was not merely another island, another point on the map to be traded for time. It was the key to the entire Philippine archipelago, and if it fell, the road to Manila, and eventually to Japan itself, would lie open. So the transports kept coming, night after night, hugging the coast, racing through the darkness to reach Ormoc before American aircraft could catch them in daylight. The Japanese had fortified the bay with everything they could muster. Coastal artillery positions carved into the cliffs, their guns ranging from 75 mm to massive 150 mm weapons capable of hulling a destroyer with a single hit. Submarine pickets lurking in the deep water outside the bay's entrance. Mines sown in irregular patterns that changed with each tide, and above all, aircraft. Zeros, Bettys, Vals, every flyable machine that could be scraped together from airfields across Mindanao and the Visayas, tasked with destroying any American vessel foolish enough to approach what had become, in effect, a Japanese lake. The intelligence officers aboard the 3 destroyers had laid it all out during the final briefing before departure. Charts showing known gun positions, though everyone understood that known was a generous description. Reports of submarine activity, though the exact number and location of boats remained maddeningly vague. Aerial reconnaissance photos of Ormoc's docks, crowded with transports and smaller craft, protected by at least 1 Japanese destroyer and possibly more. The officers had not sugar-coated the odds. This was a raid, a high-speed penetration into heavily defended waters, a calculated gamble that the element of surprise and the destroyer's superior gunnery might allow them to wreak havoc before the Japanese could coordinate an effective response. If things went according to plan, they would dash in, unload everything they had at point-blank range, and race back out to open water before dawn. If things went wrong, well, the officers had not dwelt on that possibility, but every man aboard understood that Ormoc Bay could easily become their grave. The run-in had begun hours earlier, shortly after sunset, with the 3 ships in column formation, Cooper in the lead, followed by Moale and M. Sumner. They had hugged Leyte's northern coast initially, staying close enough to shore that the landmass might confuse Japanese radar, then swung west across the Kamate Sea toward the narrow waters separating Leyte from Cebu. The crews had been at general quarters since before dark, every man at his assigned station, watertight doors dogged shut, ammunition hoists loaded, fire control radars sweeping the darkness for threats. On Cooper's bridge, Captain Walter Thomas Moore Griffin stood beside the helmsman, his eyes moving constantly from the compass to the radar repeater to the dark horizon ahead. Griffin was a career officer, Annapolis class of 1930, a man who had spent 14 years preparing for command and now found himself leading his ship into the most dangerous waters of the Pacific. He was 35 years old, though the responsibilities of command had added years to his face. Around him, the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, their movements economical, their voices low and calm, but beneath that professional veneer every man was acutely aware that they were sailing toward a battle that could erupt at any moment. The Japanese found them long before they reached Ormoc Bay. The first attack came screaming out of the northern sky at 2,310 hours, a single Betty bomber that must have been on patrol, its pilot spotting the telltale wakes in the moonless dark or perhaps catching a radar return from his primitive airborne set. The plane came in low and fast, engines howling, and suddenly the night exploded into violence as every anti-aircraft gun in the formation opened fire simultaneously. The sky filled with tracers, red and orange streams of light arcing upward, 40mm Bofors shells bursting in angry orange flowers, the heavier 5-inch guns from the main batteries joining in with proximity-fused shells that detonated in brilliant white flashes. The noise was indescribable, a physical assault on the senses, the rapid hammering of the Bofors guns overlaid with the deeper crump of the 5-inch mounts and underneath it all the high-pitched scream of the diving bomber. The Betty released its torpedo from perhaps 800 yards, close enough that men on Cooper's deck could see the silhouette of the aircraft against the stars, could see the moment the torpedo splashed into the water trailing a streak of luminescence. Griffin ordered hard right rudder and the destroyer heeled sharply, her screws churning white water, and the torpedo passed down the port side close enough that several sailors swore they could have reached out and touched it. The Betty, caught in the concentrated fire of 3 destroyers, disintegrated in midair, a brief orange fireball that tumbled into the sea trailing burning debris. But if the pilot managed to get off a radio report before he died, then every Japanese unit within 50 miles now knew American destroyers were heading for Ormoc. They came on anyway. There was no question of turning back, no possibility of aborting the mission. Too much depended on it. MacArthur's entire campaign hinged on breaking the Japanese supply line, on strangling Yamashita's forces before they could dig in so deeply that rooting them out would cost thousands of American lives. So the 3 destroyers increased speed to 27 knots and raced through the darkness while above them the air battle continued. More Japanese aircraft appeared, singles and pairs, trying different approach angles, probing for weaknesses in the formation's anti-aircraft umbrella. The sky became a kaleidoscope of tracers and explosions, and the smell of cordite hung so thick in the humid air that men breathed it with every lungful, the acrid chemical stink mixing with the salt spray and the oil smoke from the ship's stacks. Some of the Japanese planes got close enough to drop their weapons, torpedoes that the destroyers dodged with violent maneuvers, bombs that raised towering columns of white water dangerously near the ship's hulls. But the formation remained intact, the ships working together with the practiced coordination of a well-trained team, their combined fire creating an almost impenetrable barrier of steel and high explosive. At 2,340 hours they passed between Ponson Island and Leyte's western coast, threading through the narrow channel that marked the entrance to Ormoc Bay, and suddenly the tactical situation transformed from dangerous to desperate. Shore batteries opened fire from both sides, their muzzle flashes orange stabs in the darkness, and seconds later the first shells arrived, screaming in with that distinctive freight train rumble that made experienced sailors' stomachs clench. The destroyers increased to flank speed, 34 knots, their engineering plants straining, turbines howling as the ships drove forward into the Gauntlet. Waterspouts erupted all around them, towering pillars of spray where Japanese shells fell just short or just wide, and occasionally there was the distinctive clang of metal on metal when fragments struck the ship's hulls. On Cooper's fantail, damage control parties crouched behind whatever cover they could find, holding fire hoses and emergency equipment, waiting for the hit that everyone knew was coming eventually. The ship vibrated from stem to stern, every rivet and weld plate thrumming with the energy of the racing turbines, and men had to shout to be heard over the combined din of engines, gunfire, and explosions. The bay opened before them like a dark throat, and in the faint starlight reflecting off the water they could make out the shapes of ships at anchor near the town of Ormoc itself, perhaps 3 miles distant. Griffin ordered his fire control officer to begin target acquisition, and moments later Cooper's forward turrets swung toward the harbor, their directors locked on a fat transport silhouetted against the shore. The destroyer's 5-inch guns spoke first, belching flame and smoke, and the first salvo was already in the air when Moale and M. Sumner joined in, all 3 ships firing as fast as their crews could load and train. The transport never had a chance. Shells rained down on her from 3 directions, punching through her thin plating, detonating inside her holds where ammunition and supplies were stacked. She erupted in a massive explosion that lit up the entire bay, a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the air and revealed every ship and structure in the harbor in stark relief. For a moment, frozen in that hellish light, the American sailors could see it all. The docks crowded with smaller vessels, the warehouses along the waterfront, and most critically, the lean silhouette of a Japanese destroyer, possibly a Matsu class or one of the older Fubuki types, getting underway from the inner harbor, black smoke pouring from her stacks as her crew scrambled to bring her into the fight. The 3 American destroyers shifted fire with deadly efficiency, their crews working with the speed that came from months of drilling and the desperate knowledge that hesitation meant death. Cooper and Moale concentrated on the Japanese destroyer while M. Sumner continued to hammer the docks and shore installations, her guns sweeping methodically along the waterfront, setting fires that quickly spread to nearby buildings. The Japanese destroyer, later identified as Kua, returned fire gamely, her 4.7-inch guns flashing in the darkness, but she was outclassed and outnumbered. American shells walked toward her across the water, each salvo closer than the last, and then she was hit, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Fire blossomed along her deck, and she began to list to starboard. Her crew fought desperately to save her, and for a few minutes it seemed they might succeed, but Cooper put a final salvo into her waterline and she rolled over with shocking speed, capsizing completely, her keel reflecting the fires burning across the harbor before she slid beneath the surface, trailing steam and oil and the screams of drowning men. But the Japanese had not been idle. Unknown to the American commanders, there were submarines in Ormoc Bay, boats that had been operating as part of the resupply effort, lying on the bottom during daylight and surfacing at night to ferry supplies ashore in their waterproof cargo spaces. One of these boats, possibly RO-26 or RO-47, sources remain unclear, had heard the battle erupt and her captain had made the instantaneous decision to attack. In the chaos and darkness, with fires burning across the harbor and ships maneuvering at high speed, the submarine had achieved a perfect firing position. At 0015 hours on December 7th, 2 torpedoes left her tubes, their wakes invisible in the churned and burning water, tracking toward the lead American destroyer at 45 knots. The first torpedo missed. The second did not. It struck USS Cooper on the starboard side aft, directly beneath the after engine room, and the explosion was catastrophic. The 600-pound warhead detonated against the thin hull plating, and the focused energy of the blast, channeled by the water, punched through the destroyer's side and into her vitals like a hammer through glass. The entire stern section from frame 120 aft simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form, torn open and twisted, flooding instantly with thousands of tons of seawater that rushed in with the force of a tidal wave. Men in the after-engine room died instantly, crushed by the blast or drowned in the first seconds as the space filled completely. The ship's keel snapped, the structural spine that held her together breaking under stresses it was never designed to withstand, and Cooper began to fold in the middle, her bow rising as her stern sank, the 2 sections hinging on the shattered midships like a closing book. On the bridge, Griffin felt the explosion through the deck plates. A massive shudder that ran the length of the ship followed immediately by a sickening lurch to starboard. Damage reports started coming in over the sound-powered phones. But even before the first words were spoken, everyone on the bridge understood. That particular quality of explosion, that deep, hollow boom followed by the immediate list, could only mean one thing. A torpedo hit below the waterline, catastrophic flooding, a mortal wound. Griffin gave the order to abandon ship, his voice steady despite the certain knowledge that he was speaking his own death sentence. Naval tradition and regulation were absolute on this point. The captain went down with his ship, and throughout Cooper's surviving sections men began the desperate struggle to escape a vessel that was sinking under them with terrifying speed. The destroyer's loudspeaker system was dead, electrical power gone except for emergency battery-powered lighting that cast everything in a dim red glow. So the word to abandon ship passed from man to man, shouted over the roar of inrushing water and the screech of tearing metal. Men grabbed life jackets if they could reach them, but many couldn't. The ship was already tilting at such a severe angle that moving was like climbing a cliff face. Some sailors simply jumped from wherever they stood, leaping into the burning water below, choosing the uncertain odds of the sea over the certainty of being trapped inside a sinking ship. Others tried to launch life rafts or release the floater nets. But there was no time for anything organized or planned. USS Cooper was sinking with a speed that defied belief, her shattered hull pulling her down, and the men who didn't get off in the first 30 seconds faced a desperate race against physics and fate. Ensign Earl H. Taylor was in the forward part of the ship when the torpedo hit, and the upward angle of the tilting deck threw him off his feet. He clawed his way toward the rail, using stanchions and cleats as handholds, his muscles screaming with effort as he dragged himself up what had become a steep slope. Other men were doing the same, a stream of sailors fighting toward the high side, toward air and open water and the slim chance of survival. Taylor reached the rail and paused for just a second, looking back at the chaos behind him. Men trapped in passageways, pinned by equipment that had torn loose, screaming for help that would never come, and then he jumped. The water was warm, almost bathwater warm, but it was also covered with a film of fuel oil from Cooper's ruptured bunkers, and the moment Taylor surfaced he was choking on the stuff, the taste indescribably foul, the thick liquid coating his face and hair and getting into his eyes until he could barely see. Around him the water was full of men, hundreds of them, some swimming strongly away from the sinking destroyer, others floating motionless, already dead or too injured to save themselves, and everywhere the sea was lit by the fires still burning across the harbor and by the continuing explosions as Cooper's ammunition magazines cooked off, sending columns of flame shooting up from her breaking hull. 57 seconds. That was how long USS Cooper remained afloat after the torpedo struck. Observers on Moale and Sumner, still engaged in their own desperate battle, watched in horror as their sister ship folded and plunged, her bow standing nearly vertical for a moment, silhouetted against the fires of burning Ormoc, before she slid beneath the surface in a roar of escaping air and steam. She took 191 men with her, sailors who never made it off, who were trapped below decks or caught in the suction of her final plunge or simply too badly injured to swim. The water where she had been was a roiling chaos of debris and fuel oil and swimming men, and the two surviving destroyers faced an agonizing choice. Stop to pick up survivors and become sitting ducks for whatever had killed Cooper, or continue the mission and leave their shipmates to whatever fate awaited them in those hostile waters. They continued the mission. It was the only choice that made tactical sense, however much it tore at the hearts of every man who made it. Moale and Sumner increased speed and raced the length of the harbor, their guns still firing, still destroying everything they could reach, wreaking havoc that would be remembered in Japanese accounts as one of the most devastating raids of the entire Philippine campaign. They sank another transport, destroyed 3 ammunition dumps that went up in spectacular explosions, and so thoroughly wrecked the harbor facilities that Ormoc would be essentially useless as a port for weeks to come. Then they turned and ran for the open sea, threading back through the gauntlet of shore batteries, dodging more aerial attacks, and somehow, miraculously, both ships made it out intact, battered and holed but still afloat, still fighting, carrying the news of Cooper's loss back to the fleet. Behind them in Ormoc Bay, 376 men fought for their lives in water that had become a nightmare of oil and fire and darkness. The fuel oil was the worst part. It coated everything, made breathing a constant struggle, got into mouths and noses and lungs, and many men who survived the sinking would die from inhaling the toxic fumes or from exhaustion as they tried to swim while essentially encased in liquid sludge. Japanese shore batteries continued to fire sporadically, and some shells fell among the swimmers, adding to the horror with random bursts of shrapnel and concussion. The surviving officers and senior enlisted men tried to organize groups, tried to get men onto floating debris or lash them together with rope from life jackets, tried to maintain some semblance of order and morale, but it was chaos, a desperate free-for-all where every man had to focus simply on keeping his head above water through the long hours until dawn. Taylor swam. He had been a good swimmer in high school, had won medals at meets in his hometown in Oklahoma, and now those skills became the difference between life and death. He struck out toward the dark mass of Leyte, visible only as a slightly denser shadow against the starfield, perhaps 5 miles distant, maybe more, impossible to judge accurately. Other men swam with him, forming a loose group that stayed together more through shared desperation than any conscious plan. They kicked steadily, mechanically, trying to conserve energy, trying not to think about what might be beneath them in the depths. Sharks attracted by blood and noise, more submarines, mines, any of 1,000 ways to die. The oil made everything harder, adding drag, coating their skin until they felt like they were swimming through molasses. But stopping meant sinking, meant giving up, so they kept going stroke after stroke after stroke through the endless tropical night. Some men couldn't maintain the pace. Taylor heard them calling out, their voices growing fainter, begging for help or for God or simply crying out in despair as the water claimed them. There was nothing he could do. Stopping to help meant dying alongside them. The brutal calculus of survival allowed no room for heroism. So he swam on, and the men who couldn't keep up fell behind and were swallowed by the darkness and the indifferent sea. Hours passed, though time lost all meaning in that black void of water and sky. Taylor's arms felt like lead, each stroke requiring a conscious act of will. His legs cramping viciously, but the dark line of the shore seemed to be growing closer, taking on definition, and that tiny hope was enough to keep him moving. Dawn came with tropical suddenness, the sun rising over the mountains of Leyte and revealing the full scope of the disaster. The water was dotted with debris and bodies, some men still swimming, others floating face down in their life jackets, and scattered across miles of ocean were small groups of survivors clinging to wreckage or simply treading water, waiting for rescue that they had no guarantee would come. Taylor and perhaps 30 other men had made it to within a mile of shore, close enough to see the white line of surf breaking on the beach, close enough to see the green wall of jungle beyond. They redoubled their efforts, driving toward land with the last of their strength, and finally, exhausted beyond description, they felt sand beneath their feet and crawled onto a narrow beach on Leyte's western coast. They had landed in territory that was, technically, still contested. The Japanese held the interior, American forces controlled most of the coast, and in between was a no-man's land where patrols from both sides hunted each other through the jungle. But the men who found Taylor's group were not Japanese soldiers or American Marines. They were Filipino guerrillas, resistance fighters who had been waging a shadow war against the occupation for 3 years, and they emerged from the jungle like ghosts, initially wary, weapons ready, until they saw the oil-covered American sailors collapsed on the beach. Then the Filipinos became rescuers, bringing water and food, binding up injuries with strips torn from their own clothing, and organizing a chain of guides to lead the survivors through the jungle to American lines. Taylor would later say that he owed his life to those anonymous villagers and fighters, men and women who risked Japanese reprisals to save enemy sailors they had never met and would never see again. Other survivors were not so fortunate or so resourceful. The majority of Cooper's crew who made it off the ship found themselves still in Ormoc Bay at dawn, scattered across the water, exhausted and oil-soaked and desperately vulnerable. The Japanese could have slaughtered them. Shore batteries could have fired into the groups of swimmers, or patrol boats could have machine-gunned them in the water, but whether through mercy or simple distraction, the harbor was still burning from the American raid, and Japanese forces were focused on saving what they could of their supplies. The swimmers were left unmolested. What came for them instead was one of the war's more unlikely rescues. Navy PBY Catalina flying boats, those ungainly but incredibly versatile seaplanes that had served in every theater of the war, came wallowing into Ormoc Bay in broad daylight, ignoring the obvious danger, focused solely on pulling American sailors out of the water. The pilots were volunteers, every one of them, because flying a lumbering, unarmed seaplane into waters surrounded by Japanese guns and aircraft was about as close to suicide as aviation got. But they came anyway, landing in the oil-slicked water, taxiing between groups of swimmers, their crew chiefs leaning out the waist hatches to haul men aboard. Each Catalina was supposed to carry a crew of 9 and perhaps a half-dozen passengers. They left Ormoc Bay with 20-30, in one case 43 men crammed into every available space, the overloaded aircraft barely able to stagger into the air, wallowing through the sky on the edge of a stall, straining to reach friendly territory before Japanese fighters could intercept them. 191 men died when USS Cooper sank. 185 survived, pulled from the water by those PBY crews or making it to shore on their own, and every single one of them carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath, there was no time to grieve, no time to process the trauma, because the battle for Leyte was still raging and the mission, the reason Cooper and her crew had sailed into Ormoc Bay in the first place, had succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. The raid had destroyed Japan's primary resupply port on Leyte's west coast at precisely the moment when American forces were preparing their final offensive. On December 7th, the day after Cooper sank, MacArthur launched his masterstroke. A massive amphibious landing directly at Ormoc, 8,000 men of the 77th Infantry Division splashing ashore from landing craft, bypassing Japanese defensive positions and cutting across the base of the Leyte Valley to sever Japanese communications and supply lines. The landing was virtually unopposed because Japanese forces, reeling from the destruction wrought by the 3 destroyers, were disorganized and unable to coordinate an effective response. American troops advancing from the north and south, which had been grinding through fierce resistance for weeks, suddenly found enemy positions collapsing as isolated Japanese units, cut off from resupply and reinforcement, ran out of ammunition and food. Yamashita had concentrated roughly 40,000 troops on Leyte, veterans of campaigns across Asia, skilled jungle fighters who had been expected to contest every meter of ground in a battle that American planners feared might drag on for months. Instead, the combination of the destroyed port facilities, the severed supply lines, and the rapid American advance from 3 directions created a cascading collapse. Japanese units fragmented, communications broke down, and what had been an organized defense deteriorated into isolated pockets of resistance. Some units fought to the last man, true to the Bushido code that prohibited surrender, turning hillside bunkers and jungle clearings into small fortresses that had to be reduced one by one with flamethrowers and explosives. Others simply melted into the mountains, becoming stragglers who would continue a hopeless guerrilla campaign for months or even years, living on roots and whatever they could scavenge, dying slowly of starvation and disease. The final act of the Ormoc Bay tragedy came on December 11th when a Japanese convoy, apparently operating without updated intelligence on the tactical situation, sailed directly into what was now American-controlled water. The convoy consisted of several transports and destroyer escorts carrying reinforcements and supplies, and its commander apparently believed he was making a routine, if dangerous, supply run into a port still in Japanese hands. Instead, he found American cruisers and destroyers waiting for him. The resulting battle was less a fight than an execution. American ships fell on the convoy like wolves on sheep, sinking every transport and most of the escorts in an action that lasted less than an hour. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, packed into the transport's holds, went down with the ships or died in the water, and the few who made it to shore were hunted down by American patrols and Filipino guerrillas. It was the absolute end of any Japanese hope of holding Leyte through resupply, the final severing of the lifeline that had kept Yamashita's forces fighting. By Christmas 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Leyte had effectively ceased. Pockets of Japanese soldiers would hold out in the mountains for months, and the formal declaration of the campaign's end wouldn't come until May 1945. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Leyte was American. The gateway to the Philippines was open, and MacArthur's promised return had become a reality. The cost had been high, over 3,000 American soldiers killed, nearly 10,000 wounded, and ships like Cooper lost with their crews, but the strategic consequences were immense. With Leyte secured, American forces could move on Luzon, could begin the reconquest of the entire Philippine archipelago, could establish air and naval bases that would support the final drive toward Japan itself. In the decades that followed, survivors of USS Cooper would gather at reunions, fewer each year as age and time took their inevitable toll, and they would tell the story of that night in Ormoc Bay to anyone who would listen. They spoke of Captain Griffin, who stayed on the bridge as his ship sank, saluting his men as they abandoned ship, going down with Cooper as tradition demanded. They spoke of the Filipino villagers who saved their lives at great risk to themselves. They spoke of the PBY pilots who flew into a shooting gallery to pull them from the water. And they spoke of the mission, of what they had accomplished in those brief, violent minutes before the torpedo struck, of the Japanese supplies that never reached their destinations, of the enemy ships sent to the bottom, of the port facilities destroyed, of the contribution their sacrifice had made to the liberation of the Philippines and to the eventual victory over Japan. The wreck of USS Cooper lies somewhere on the bottom of Ormoc Bay, probably in relatively shallow water, perhaps 400 or 500 feet down, resting on the mud and silt that covers the floor of that once contested bay. Her hull is almost certainly broken in half, the two sections lying some distance apart, coral and marine growth covering the steel, fish sheltering in the spaces that once held men and machinery and the hopes of a nation at war. She rests there still, a war grave, a memorial to 191 men who sailed into danger knowing the odds and doing their duty anyway, and a testament to a night when 3 American destroyers challenged an enemy stronghold and paid a terrible price for a victory that helped change the course of the Pacific War. If the story moved you, if you felt the terror of those sailors in the water, the desperation of the Filipino rescuers, the courage of the PBY pilots, then honor their memory by subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button to ensure more of these forgotten stories reach the people who need to hear them. And tell me in the comments, would you have had the courage to sail into Ormoc Bay knowing what those men knew? Would you have volunteered to fly that rescue mission? Leave your answer below. These men deserve to be remembered, and every subscription, every like, every comment ensures their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Do it for Cooper. Do it for the 191 who never came home. Do it now.